Hi, my name's Ash, and welcome to Paved with Gold, the eating disorder recovery podcast. I want to acknowledge the traditional landowners on which I am recording, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Thank you for joining me today. Callie is still on her parental leave, so I figured for this episode, I thought it'd be a good idea to go back to basics in a sense. I was actually talking about this podcast on a work call earlier last week, whenever it was, doing like a little presentation talking about the podcast to pretty much a room full of people who know nothing about eating disorders. And I got a really nice response. However, when you live in the world of eating disorder recovery, you forget how little some people actually know about eating disorders. And I think one of the reasons there is still a taboo in talking about them, or there's still this stigma attached to them, is because there's still a lot of misconceptions around eating disorders. So today, I figured I would debunk some of them and talk about them from a lived experience point of view, while also going through some, facts and figures and some research and really nut down on what eating disorders are and what they're not. So while some of these might be a little, duh, Ash, we know this, I figured this could be a starting point if you wanted to send this to a loved one or a carer or even someone who has expressed some uninformed views about eating disorders. Allow me to break some of these misconceptions down for you. And of course, there are probably some people listening who are trying to get a little bit of understanding if they want to help a loved one. So if those people are listening, this episode is for you as well. But I also wanted to talk about some of the myths about treatment that could be relevant to everybody. So I'm sure that there's something in here that everyone can take away. But obviously, a general trigger warning. I will touch on some weight stigma topics throughout this episode, some trauma, just general eating disorder things. So please be mindful of that. And if this is going to be too much for you, please just sit this one out and I'll see you in the next one. So I think it is a good idea to start with why these myths and misconceptions exist in the first place. We already know from research that mental health literacy in the community generally remains low, meaning that there isn't much open discussion and understanding of mental health conditions in society as a whole. And I think this is particularly pertinent when we look at how the community responds to eating disorders in particular. But I don't think we can talk about the pervasiveness of eating disorder misconceptions without talking about weight stigma and the impact of dieting in our society. And I mean, you've heard me say this 1,000 times, and I'll keep saying it, that diet culture is everywhere. And just so everyone knows what I mean by diet culture, Australian eating disorder charity Butterfly Foundation defines diet culture as, quote, a set of ever-changing myths about food and bodies, promoting the idea that one person's body weight automatically equals health, and that food can be simplistically categorized as good and bad. It also comprises a moral hierarchy of bodies that preferences the thin ideal while masking a fear of fatness. These cultural ideals are driven by broad systems and structures of power, such as patriarchal ideas about women's bodies, radicalized ideals around thinness and health, and capitalist industries that profit from body dissatisfaction and confusion around food and eating. End quote. Mic drop. Many of us, myself included, grew up almost like as a fish that was swimming in the ocean that was diet culture, with just as many of us being unaware of how much that culture shaped a lot of our views on weight, shape, and how we need to move and eat in this world. It was always this demonization of thin is good, fat is bad, and do whatever you can to avoid being fat. And people who were fat were seen as slovenly, or they were seen as lazy. And that later on, further on in the 90s, when it shifted from fatness or obesity in inverted commas to being a disease, then it was like, oh, it all slipped to, oh, I don't want you to die. Oh, it's all around health. And it's all just bullshit. It's just a smokescreen that people can use to justify their anti-fat bias. And it's just a smokescreen for people to sell you shit that you don't need, that to fund the diet industry and all of that. So unless you're actively seeking out this discourse around diet culture and why it has such a horrible impact on pretty much everyone everywhere, but especially people who are fat or at high weights, so much of this diet culture goes by unchallenged, with people completely unaware of its impact and pervasiveness. But of course, now diet culture has slipped into this new outfit, which is wellness, although it all sings from the same song sheet. It's just diet culture 2.0. Nothing has changed here, except now the focus seems to be on health rather than looks, which for many is even more stigmatizing, even though people still judge health based on looks. So it's really exactly the same thing, right? But of course, when we talk about this in the context of why there are misconceptions around eating disorders, society looks at diet culture as quote unquote normal part of life, which means it is very easy to dismiss the early signs of an eating disorder as exactly this, something that normal people do. Oh, you're going on a diet? Oh, yeah, that's normal. I mean, and this is especially pertinent for fat folk because they are meant to be, this is something that they are supposed to be seen active in. They're meant to be active in weight loss and dieting and changing their bodies. They need to be seen as the quote unquote good fatty so that they fit into these, or look like they're at least trying to lose weight because that's what they're supposed to be doing. And when those people at high weights or fat folk have eating disorders, they're almost praised for that. As I'm sure you can understand, if you're praising someone for having an eating disorder because they're trying to conform to these thin ideals, can you just imagine how much damage that's causing? And I think all of this contributes to why people don't take eating disorders seriously and why people don't want to talk about them. They are scary, they are serious, and often they are difficult to treat. So, with the poor mental health literacy combined with society's expectations to perpetuate the thin ideal, plus the multi-trillion-dollar diet and wellness industry that funds so much of this society, it is no wonder that people can be super quick to dismiss eating disorders as just, oh yeah, normal, nothing to worry about, not really that serious. But of course, I'm getting carried away. Shocker, never done that before. But let's dive into some myths and misconceptions because I think the first one dovetails nicely off what I was just talking about. And the first myth is that eating disorders are a lifestyle choice or about vanity. Yeah, I mean, they're not. This was actually one of the myths that I pulled out in my work presentation that I mentioned before. And some people couldn't even believe that this was a thing. But yes, it still very much is. There are some people in this world who think that people choose to have an eating disorder because it's fashionable or they want to achieve a body ideal or it's seen as oh, you've got so much willpower. Ugh, I hate it so much. And while there is a connection between body dissatisfaction and eating disorders, that does not mean that they are just about being skinny, quote unquote. Just like no one chooses to get asthma or diabetes or anxiety or an ear infection or, I don't know, tinea. No one chooses to get an eating disorder. They are serious, life-threatening illnesses that have the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric illness in Australia. And someone with an eating disorder has over 12 times higher a mortality rate than those without eating disorders. While many may have started from some form of dieting, I mean, that was how mine started, it is an oversimplification to say that they are just a diet that's gone too far. Because eating disorders, while they are still classified as mental illnesses, they, unlike most mental health conditions, not only involve tremendous psychological impairments and distress, but, and to quote Butterfly Foundation again, quote, they are also associated with major, wide-ranging and serious medical complications, which can affect every major organ in the body, end quote. Eating disorders also don't just develop because of one sole cause or trigger. Quote, they are associated with major, wide-ranging and serious medical complications, which can affect every major organ in the body, end quote. They don't always, but they can. Eating disorders also don't just develop because of one sole cause or trigger. They are diseases that are made up of and can be caused by a number of complexities, hence why they can be difficult to treat, and especially difficult to treat by a one-size-fits-all treatment. And while body image or dissatisfaction can be one of them, they can also occur outside of any desire to meet these social ideals of the thin ideal. Butterfly Foundation had another great quote, which I loved, which really encapsulated this perfectly. Quote, the development of an eating disorder is an individual pathway where genetics and personality vulnerabilities interact with social and environmental triggers, end quote. At no point do they say that someone has chosen this eating disorder. Anyone who has lived through or with any eating disorder will quickly tell you that they never chose this. And I would be pretty confident to say that many would wish it away in a heartbeat if they could. I personally would not wish an eating disorder on my worst enemy. It's a living hell. I never chose it, and I would never choose to live through it again. With all of these, I could rant about this for hours, so if I don't stop myself. So in the interest of your ears and time, I'll move on to the next myth. So the second one is eating disorders are a young white girl from the suburbs thing. I think anyone who has listened to some of the lived experience stories on previous episodes of this podcast would already know that this is unequivocally not true. When it comes to gender, racial, ethnic, cultural, geographic, and socioeconomic groups, none of them are immune to eating disorders. This misconception causes many minority groups to have their eating disorders dismissed, misdiagnosed, or missed completely by healthcare providers. I mean, I'm going to break this one down a little bit. So let's look at gender to start with. And while it is true that women are at a higher risk of eating disorders, particularly those who are going through key transition periods, especially in relation to hormones such as puberty, pregnancy, and menopause, they do not occur exclusively in this demographic. They can and do occur in high rates across the gender spectrum. Research shows that over 1/3 of people experiencing an eating disorder are men and boys. However, due to the stigma and lack of awareness and training, the number of eating disorders in men is drastically underestimated and reported. When it comes to eating disorders in trans, non-binary, and gender diverse folk, the research shows us equally harrowing numbers, with about 20 to 50% of transgender and gender diverse people reporting to be engaging in disordered eating, and slightly less than 30% screen positive for eating disorder symptoms. That was a report in 2023. However, as of this year, 2024, research conducted by guest of the pod, Kai Schweizer, found in a sample of 2,400 trans and gender diverse folk, 99.59% had disordered eating behaviors in the past 3 months, while only 13% had a current diagnosis. If you want to check out episode 21 to hear more about Kai's research, I highly recommend that you do. And if you want to hear more of a lived experience story about men and eating disorders, you can check out Liam's episode, which I believe is episode 13. So let's look at age now. It is true that the peak period of the onset of eating disorders is between the ages of 12 and 25 years, with a median age of around 18. They can and do affect anyone of any age. In fact, over the past decade, clinics around the world have seen an increase in the reports of men and women seeking treatment for eating disorders in midlife and beyond. There was a great article from the National Council of Aging that talked about some of the reasons why people may develop eating disorders later in life. There are some people who may have had an eating disorder earlier in their life, who were perhaps recovered partially or fully, and there was a relapse in their eating disorders later in life. This could be in response to some form of stresses like loss, grief, menopause, pregnancy, children leaving the home, age discrimination, the aging process itself, changes in mobility, illness, or retirement, just to name a few. But also, these reasons are stressful enough to trigger an eating disorder on its own without any previous history of an eating disorder or any kind of eating disorder tendencies. It's important to note that when we do talk about eating disorders in adults, but particularly those who are older or elderly, that there is an increased risk of health complications because eating disorders take a massive physical toll on the body as well as mental. Almost every bodily system is affected, no matter how old you are or what kind of eating disorder you have. We're talking musculoskeletal, gastrointestinal, cardiovascular, hormonal, dermatological, reproductive, brain function. But of course, the thing to consider for eating disorders in older populations is that all of these systems have become more vulnerable as we age, which means that eating disorders take an even greater toll on an aging body than they do a younger one. So it's important for clinicians and society at large not to discount people at risk of an eating disorder due to age, because the results can be devastating. I think a key thing to remember when discussing all of this is that eating disorders are a very effective coping mechanism, and stresses don't stop once you enter adulthood. In fact, for many, it gets worse. So it is totally understandable to see why adults are not immune to developing an eating disorder. Now, when it comes to socioeconomic status, the myth that this is a, quote, disease of the affluent, end quote, has been debunked over several years. There have been many studies that show this. For example, the journal Eating Behaviors published a systematic review of the literature on socioeconomic diversity in eating disorders, which found two key findings. The first is that there is no pattern of evidence that links higher socioeconomic status with eating disorders, aka anyone can develop an eating disorder regardless if they're rich, poor, or in between. And the second finding is that there is a major lack of accessible eating disorder treatment available to people of all socioeconomic statuses, with the people in lower socioeconomic status facing additional barriers to treatment, which, I mean, I didn't want to say no shit, Sherlock, but I mean, I think anyone can get them, but everyone faces barriers to treatment, especially when it comes to the financial impact of eating disorders. Published in the same journal. Oh, I probably should mention that I found a lot of really, really great articles and references for this episode. So if you want to check any of them out, you can find them on our website. So just go to the episode page and you can find them all there. But yes, published in the same journal, which is Eating Behaviors, there was a paper that looked at the data from a long-running study known as Project EAT, which tracked the health of teens as they transition into adulthood. The research showed that eating disorders were even more prevalent among young people of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and the problem compounds as teenagers grew into adults. I read another great article on the Equip Health website, which told the story of Christine, not her real name, a mother whose son developed an eating disorder that stemmed from the compounded trauma of homelessness and poverty. As a single mother, she was couch surfing at friends' places, but, quote, shelter, safety, and food were not always reliably available, end quote. There's a really powerful quote that I think summed up this mother's own misconceptions about socioeconomic status and eating disorders, which I thought was really powerful. Quote, I was linking it to willpower and making it an issue of choice. It's not. People think it's a privilege to not eat or to never go hungry. I believe food instability absolutely contributed to the triggering of my child's eating disorder, 100%. His fear foods were the foods we ate while poor and that he'd been okay with eating while poor, end quote. And I thought that was just a really powerful quote because she even admits herself that she had this misconception, but it very much, as from her lived experience, showed that it is absolutely not the case and it can be a really contributing factor to developing an eating disorder. Last thing that I will break down in this myth is the concept that eating disorders are a white people problem, which is incredibly stigmatizing for those people of other cultural and racial backgrounds. A study in the International Journal of Eating Disorders found that the rate of all eating disorders are the same or higher in all racial and ethnic groups compared to white folk. However, despite this, people in marginalized and BIPOC communities are less likely to receive or even gain access to care and services due to the systemic neglect and barriers facing them. Similarly, Black, Latina, Indigenous, Asian, and people of color have historically been omitted from the research and general conversations and discussions about eating disorders, which means not only are the numbers surrounding the prevalence of eating disorders in this community likely grossly underestimated, but culturally informed and inclusive treatment options are just largely non-existent. I was just recently at the ANZ AED annual conference, which is the ANZ Academy of Eating Disorders. And I actually, if you follow us on Instagram, I did a whole bunch of little vox pops with people who were there, which was really interesting to get a lot of people's insights on the whole thing. So you should go check that out if you're interested. I was thinking about doing like a little special episode of like a roundup of, my findings, but I'm not sure yet. If you guys are interested, let me know. But yes, there was at the conference, there was a real renewed focus, or just a new focus really, on ensuring that more research and investment is being made into finding culturally appropriate treatments for those who live with eating disorders in Indigenous and Maori communities. So I hope that this is a sign that things are changing, and hopefully I will have an episode about that very soon with someone who I met at the conference who spoke very eloquently about it. So watch this space. So, all of that to say, while there is a prevalence of eating disorders in specific high-risk groups, that does not mean that society at large should dismiss the importance of recognizing eating disorders in other populations. And in fact, I would also question whether or not, those high-risk groups should actually be reevaluated, given that a lot of them are not included in the research. Just saying. But it certainly also means that you shouldn't rule out someone having an eating disorder if they don't fit within the demographic where they are seemingly most common. Okay, I'm fully aware that this is only myth 2 and we're like 25 minutes in. So I will try and keep it pace, but you know me, I can get carried away with debunking things. So I'm going to shift gears to a myth that may be more relevant for those currently facing eating disorder treatment. And this is a common misconception for families and carers as well. So if this is you, this is your time. But I think it's also very important that we talk about it because it is a general myth that people with eating disorders are cured after inpatient treatment. Ugh, I really, really wish that this was true. It would have saved a hell of a lot of time and trauma and money. And a lot of effort. But no, I'm yet to hear of someone who came out of inpatient treatment cured, whatever that means. I'm assuming they mean recovered, but that's even a questionable term if you've listened to our recovery maintenance episode. I think it's a very nuanced term of the term recovered. But either way, for those who don't know, inpatient treatment is where a person with an eating disorder goes into hospital for an extended period of time. It could be weeks or months in order to receive intensive treatment that usually focuses on medical stabilization, nutritional restoration, psychiatric and psychological care. For some, yes, it can include the beginnings of weight restoration or weight stabilization, but that's not always the case. It is used as a life-saving intervention or used as a general reset kind of tool to kind of start from a stable place to build upon. But no one comes out of the other end cured, quote unquote. To give you an idea, I was lucky enough to go into private inpatient care 3 separate times. Very lucky. Once it was 15 weeks, another it was 6 weeks, and then the last time I believe it was 13 weeks or something. But it is not uncommon for people to have multiple hospitalizations because the rate of relapse for eating disorders is high as 70%, I believe. So if inpatients were a cure-all, people wouldn't need multiple admissions, and the average rate of recovery certainly would not be around 7 years. I think one reason to understand why you can't expect someone to go into treatment and then come out the other end completely recovered is because inpatient programs are time limited, which means that the core portion of eating disorder treatment actually happens in community care and outpatient care. So and for those who don't know what that means, community and outpatient care is, your treatment teams, such as your psychologist, your psychiatrist, your social worker, dietitian, outpatient programs, group therapy, those kind of things. So that is where the bulk of recovery can actually happen, where you take a lot of the tools that you learn in these programs and these services and implement them into your everyday life, because I think you can be very much trapped in a bubble in inpatient treatment, and inpatient is not real life. And so there is a big transition period when you go from inpatient back into the quote unquote real world, especially back into the environment where your eating disorder flourished and developed and was so strong. So that is why I think it can be a really testing time, and that's where the bulk of recovery happens. Hospitalization should be considered as the beginning of a long-term treatment plan. So you or your family member or friend or whoever should not expect your eating disorder to vanish following discharge. Unfortunately, it just doesn't happen that way. I wish it did, but it doesn't. Of course, it does need to be said that there are many people who live with eating disorders who will never gain access to inpatient treatment because they do not meet the admission requirements, which is totally messed up because all eating disorders are serious and they should all be able to access treatment. However, I just wanted to put that out there in case there are people sitting here thinking, oh, I wish that I could go into inpatient treatment, but I can't access it. I absolutely hear you. I felt that this was a myth that was important to include, as I know that it can come up a lot with people in families just expecting people to be better once they leave hospital. Yeah, no, it's just the beginning of a long road in many cases. So cut yourself or your loved one some slack. So the fourth myth that I want to crack is that you can tell by looking at someone that they have an eating disorder. You knew it was coming. No, you can't, guys. Please stop trying. And just as we discussed earlier, you cannot tell someone has an eating disorder based on their race, their gender, their perceived socioeconomic status, or their age, because we just debunked that. So eating disorders can and do affect anyone. What I think that this myth that you can tell by looking at someone that they have an eating disorder is rooted in the idea that eating disorders have one look, and that is thin and or emaciated, and that is, surprise, surprise, completely untrue. Any listeners of past episodes will have heard us whip out a very important statistic, which is that fewer than 6% of people with eating disorders present quote unquote underweight. That means that the overwhelming majority of people with eating disorders are in straight-sized and higher weight or fat bodies. So immediately debunked right there. But you know that I'm not going to stop there because it's me. So if we delve a little deeper, This myth also suggests that there is only one type of eating disorder, and that is anorexia nervosa, which is equally untrue. And don't worry, I will get into debunking some of the stuff around anorexia very shortly. There are so many other eating disorders that have specific criteria, specific symptoms, and behaviors. Some of them may overlap, but a lot of them, can be quite different. And these include, but are not limited to, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, RFID, which is avoidant and restrictive food intake, which is actually becoming very common, particularly neurodivergent folks, which I'm pretty sure we're going to be doing a whole episode on at some point. But then there's also pica, rumination disorder, and other specified feeding or eating disorder, which is also known as OSFED. And side note, if you noticed I didn't mention atypical anorexia on purpose, you are very observant because I absolutely detest that term with a passion for reasons that will be discussed shortly. But yes, as we always say, all kinds of eating disorders and disordered eating are serious and worth treatment. And you can't tell if someone has any kind of eating disorder by looking at them, because while there may be some visible signs for some conditions, sometimes this is not applicable to everybody. So not every person with an eating disorder is thin, but in a similar vein, it is also a myth that the only eating disorder people in large bodies and fat folk can possibly have involves the consumption of large amounts of food, such as binge eating disorder or bulimia. This view is firmly rooted in weight stigma and is so false. Oh my goodness. In fact, people in large and fat bodies are at the highest risk of having developed an eating disorder in their lives, and there is some evidence that suggests that the higher weight the individual is, the higher the risk of developing an eating disorder. And I personally believe that is largely due to weight stigma and the oppression and discrimination that's faced every day by fat folk. And furthermore to that, people at high weights and in fat bodies are less likely to receive an eating disorder diagnosis, particularly if they are showing every other sign of anorexia nervosa. And in fact, if I may quote Aubrey Gordon, she was told by a doctor after eloquently describing her eating disorder behaviors that she, quote, looked like she hadn't missed a meal in a while, end quote. Who's that doctor? I just want to have a chat, just a little chat. But anyone can develop any kind of eating disorder, and people at higher weights are more likely to develop restrictive-based eating disorders, to the point that a new category had to be invented, which is called, quote-unquote, atypical anorexia, which I hate so much. It's basically colloquially just anorexia for fat people. The only difference between anorexia and atypical anorexia is the weight classification. Seriously, it's the only reason. If you want to listen to more about this, you can hear Nick McDermott's episode about eating disorders in fat folk, which she describes this very eloquently. So I highly recommend you check that out. But eating disorder Hope describes it exactly as, quote, an individual who meets all the criteria for anorexia nervosa, except that despite significant weight loss, the individual's weight is within or above the normal range, end quote. And yes, that is referring to the BMI, which is complete and utter garbage, despite the general consensus agreeing that it is useless and harmful. I still hate that it's used in eating disorder criteria, but, we can't burn it down and start again, apparently, as much as we'd like to. But no, atypical anorexia, and in general, please know that I'm using this term with gigantic quotation marks because to me, it is basically just anorexia, but to make this point, I need to use it. As the name suggests, atypical anorexia is not seen as serious. However, the small research that we do have indicates that psychological distress related to eating and body image is worse in atypical anorexia than anorexia nervosa. And more research is telling us that atypical isn't even atypical anymore because it is showing to be far more common than anorexia with low weight. So the name itself is totally inaccurate. So we should stop using it, by the way. Again, I don't want to get carried away because I know I absolutely can. And this is definitely going to be a future episode. But I think in this myth, it is really important to remove any preconceived notions that eating disorders look a particular way. And society, but also the eating disorder treatment community as a whole, needs to do a lot of unlearning to confront their weight biases. It's a long process. It's a long process and it's hard and it's uncomfortable. But I feel that if we want to really put patients first and we really want to see a world that, treats eating disorders seriously, we need to do a lot of unlearning. So Like I said, for more information on this, you can listen to, we've done a bunch of episodes, which I found super interesting. Our episode with Dr. Asha Lamy, which is episode 14, and episode 7, like I said, about eating disorders and fat folk with Nick McDermott are great places to start if you want to hear some lived experience. And of course, you always know that I'm going to plug her. Aubrey Gordon's books, What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, and You Just Need to Lose Weight, and 19 Other Myths About Fat People can be an amazing starting point if you want to learn more about this and start unlearning any biases. Those books, along with other things like Anti-Diet and The Wellness Trap by Christy Harrison, are also great places to start as well. And Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings is equally brilliant. So I highly encourage you to also seek out a lot of your own sources as well, because there's plenty out there, because a lot of people are doing some really amazing work to help lead this unlearning process. Okay, next one. The fifth myth is that families, particularly parents, are to blame for someone developing an eating disorder. Let me put a general statement out before diving deep. Eating disorders are no one's fault. There's no one single cause for an eating disorder, and they are incredibly complex conditions that, according to the University of Rochester Medical Center, can arise from, quote, a variety of predisposing, precipitating, and perpetuating factors coming together in at-risk individuals in a complex and dynamic interplay, end quote. Which basically means it's a melting pot of a variety of factors, including genetics, environment, neurobiology, trauma, etc., and then how all of those things interact with each other. There is no evidence to suggest that eating disorders are caused by any particular parenting style. And while traditionally parents, mothers in particular, were unfairly blamed for their child's eating disorders, especially when eating disorders were diagnosed in children, but also as adults, more recent research supports that eating disorders have a strong biological root. So nature, not nurture, was more likely a contributing factor to the development of an eating disorder. And I know that one of the strongest forces on this planet can be parental guilt, if my mum is anything to go by. So I know that if there are any parents listening and you're feeling like, this is my fault, you may be questioning everything you've ever said or done, please don't. Please stop blaming yourself, because it is not your fault. You are not the cause of your child's eating disorder. There is no telling if one person will develop an eating disorder or not. And you could take two completely genetically identical people, raise them the same, and one person may develop an eating disorder while the other may not. Eating disorders develop differently for each person affected, and there's no single set of rules that any parent can follow to guarantee the prevention of an eating disorder. I wish there was, but unfortunately that's not. Unfortunately, eating disorders are very effective coping mechanisms, like I said before, and they help people withstand really difficult life circumstances. They are effective as hell. As I think if you listen to a lot of our episodes, you can hear they were coping mechanisms for a lot of people. They make people feel safe in many cases. So unfortunately, you can't parent your way out of potentially your child developing an eating disorder. That being said, however, family systems and parents can and do play a crucial role in eating disorder recovery for the affected person. And while you may not have caused an eating disorder, there's a lot you can do to help create a recovery promoting environment. It is really important that family and friends, where possible, play an active role in a person's eating disorder treatment, both an adult and a child, but particularly for children, from both the initial assessment as well as in ongoing recovery. Now, I don't want people to hear me saying this if they have experienced family trauma or abuse at the hands of their parents and think that I'm giving parents a total free pass and say, oh no, it wasn't your fault, because those kinds of environments and dynamics can absolutely contribute to some people developing an eating disorder, especially where that eating disorder was used as a coping mechanism to deal with those kind of dynamics. There's obviously a lot of nuance here. And I would still stand by the concept that no eating disorder has one core trigger or cause, but I do want to acknowledge people in those situations because they are very, very valid. And I'm not saying that, people are that if there has been those kind of situations that have contributed to the development of an eating disorder, then that is absolutely valid and true. So I want you to hear me say that. But I do also want to talk about the fact that, and it's worth noting that recent research has shown that eating disorders do have a genetic basis. and people who have family members with an eating disorder may be at higher risk than those without a family history. This is important for any kind of harm reduction in the future. And I know if Callie was here, she would be jumping in right now to say that she is hyper aware as a mum, given her history of an eating disorder. And she's keeping an eye on her kids for any kind of warning signs, while also fostering a body positive environment at home, using weight inclusive language and promoting positive relationships with food and movement as they grow up. Of course, genetics play a role in many illnesses, including many mental illnesses. So while a person's genetics may predispose them to developing an eating disorder, it doesn't mean one will develop. They may not develop one to the same extent. And it certainly doesn't mean that it is the fault of the family member if one does develop. So, for any carers and family members out there who are listening to this is not your fault, but you do have a responsibility to acknowledge any things that you may have contributed to in terms of environment, weight stigma, family dynamics, and you can work on those in yourself, as well as providing a positive recovery focused support for your loved ones. I also fully acknowledge that eating disorders don't just affect those who live with them, but they can be a family illness, and they can take a significant toll on the extended network of someone who lives with an eating disorder. So you are worthy of support as well. Again, this will totally be a future episode where we talk about carers and support, but make sure for now that you find some carers resources to ensure you are well taken care of. And there are plenty out there, including some on our website. So I'm going to wrap up with one more, because if I don't, we'll be here a while. The last myth I'm going to talk about is that eating disorders are forever. And you know I got to end on a high note with this stuff, so I got to debunk this one. But of course, it's always a little bit more complicated. So short answer, no, they're not forever. But the long answer is it depends. And of course, I will explain why. But at the heart of it, no, eating disorders are not forever. And I know it may feel that way, but recovery is absolutely possible. It doesn't matter how long you have been living with an eating disorder, whether it be a year, 5 years, 20 years, or more, you can get better. I will never lie to you and say it's an easy process, quite the opposite. The path to recovery can be long and challenging, but with support from the right team of professionals and with a high level of commitment, a form of recovery is certainly achievable for everyone. And I say a form of recovery is possible for a reason. And as we've discussed at length on this podcast before, there is a misconception that being recovered means that all of your eating disorder thoughts and feelings and fears will go away completely or forever, and you'll forget that they ever existed. I consider myself recovered in active recovery maintenance, even after all this time, but that doesn't mean that I have never had an eating disorder thought ever again. It just means that they don't dictate any part of my life anymore, and I can easily detach and not follow through on those thoughts anymore. I mean, I do have to stay vigilant, of course. Any kind of trauma or life change or anything like that could potentially trigger a relapse, and I'm not arrogant to think that I'm immune to any kind of relapse, even after all the work I've done. But I'm so far from where I was before that I can easily detach from even strong eating disorder thoughts when they come up. I always say that learning stuff is a lot easier than unlearning stuff, because some of those old neural pathways, while they may be overgrown, they are still there. Once I have that knowledge in my head, it's so much harder to get rid of. But thankfully, I now have new, healthier neural pathways that are much stronger that I can rely on, that were developed over a lot of hard work of recovery. Last thing I will say on this is that yes, recovery is possible for everyone, but Callie and I talk regularly about this. Everyone can recover, but sadly, not everyone will. I don't want people to lose hope or give up when we say this, because hope is one of the most powerful tools and drivers in eating disorder recovery. And even if you don't feel like you do have any hope left, even if you have to get someone else to hang on to it for you for a while, there is always hope. The reason we say that not everyone will recover is because there is still so many barriers to accessing treatment and accessing the right treatment for that particular person. I've already touched on some of these barriers earlier, but it's financial, it's geographical, it's the bloody diagnostic criteria itself, it's the lack of available treatments, it's long wait times, it's the inertia of research and development of alternative treatments, it's racial and oppressive barriers, and it's weight stigma. All of those can and are barriers to treatment. And also, it's worth noting that, as many people with a lived experience say, especially those who are at higher weights or who have trauma, eating disorders are a means of keeping someone safe. And unless there's a change to allow people to move safely in this world free of oppression, violence, and stigma, then giving up an eating disorder completely could cause them harm. That's why I also say a form of recovery is possible. There are times when you may have to keep some parts of your eating disorder to keep yourself safe. While it's not ideal, if it keeps you safer in a harm reduction kind of way, then to me, that is a form of recovery. It's a form of recovery maintenance. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the nuances of recovery itself and the different types of recovery and what recovered means to a lot of people. If you want to learn more about this, you can always check out our recovery maintenance episode, which kind of talks a little bit more about this and what recovery means and what being recovered means and all of that kind of stuff. I don't know, maybe it's naive of us, but I think that's why Callie and I wanted to start this podcast, to be loud and opinionated enough that treatments and accessibility to treatments and awareness changes. And hopefully we can do that by empowering you who are listening to advocate for yourself, demand a second opinion, seek out different treatment options. If things aren't working, shout as loud as you can until you get another option. And I know it may not change everything, but the best that we can hope for is that we're all collectively loud enough to force the industry to change, because everyone deserves the right treatment for them. And they deserve to not be priced out of treatment. And they deserve to access it no matter where they live or what language they speak or whatever their background is, what color of their skin, or whatever fucking clothing size they wear. If everyone with an eating disorder was given free access to the right kind of treatment for them and their comorbidities, then I think everyone would be able to recover. I know that I sound super wide-eyed and optimistic, which is very off-brand for me, particularly if you listen to the last episode. But I think it's important that when we talk about this, the myth that eating disorders are forever, to acknowledge that some people may never recover, but that doesn't mean you can't have a better quality of life. And it certainly doesn't mean that you have to suffer for the rest of your life, or worse, lose your life to an eating disorder, because a form of recovery is absolutely possible for everyone. There are so many more myths that I could bust, but I wanted to cover these as I felt that these are some of the most common. But I'd love to hear what you guys think. I mean, should we do a part 2? Are there more myths that you want me to bust? I might put it on social media and see what you guys think. So keep an eye out on our Instagram if you want to see a part 2 on this, or you want to tell me if you do want to see one or not. But that's all for today's episode. I hope you found it useful, interesting. I hope you learnt something. There are things that I discovered for the first time in researching this episode, which was fascinating. So I hope that no matter where you are in your eating disorder journey or your journey of understanding them, that there was something that you learned here. Again, if you want to check out any of the resources and references that I used in this episode, a full list is on our website on the episode page. But thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss another episode. And if you like what you hear, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can follow us on YouTube and Instagram at pavedwithgoldpod. Send us an email at pavedwithgoldpod@gmail.com or visit our website, pavedwithgoldpodcast.com. All of those links will be in the show notes along with extra resources. And until next time, stay safe and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye. This podcast is general in nature and has not taken your personal circumstances or medical history into account. We are here to share our own experiences and the things that we have found helpful throughout our own personal recovery journeys. Please remember that each person's journey and circumstances are different, and not all of the information contained in this podcast may be relatable to you. It's important you consult your own GP or recovery team to seek out tailored advice before making any important decisions relating to your own health and recovery process. If you have found any of the content in this episode distressing, please contact your care team or a medical professional. If you or someone you know is in crisis and needs help now, please contact emergency services in your region immediately.